quantum theory is that so-called empty space isn't really empty at all. It's actually full of energy. So instead of being like kind of a quiet, empty lake, it's more like the froth at the base of a waterfall or something. And this energy is basically electromagnetic in nature, and the energy density is quite high. In fact, it's so high that when it was first discovered mathematically, it was thought to be some kind of artifact of the mathematics. But then as time went on, there were even Nobel Prize winning experiments that showed that this energy in so-called empty space was really there. We don't usually notice it because it's so homogeneously distributed. It'd sort of be like sitting in a bathtub with at exactly your body temperature. You might not notice the water. But under certain circumstances, it can be disturbed or perturbed, and then it has effects. As I mentioned, some effects on atomic emission, for example, is what eventually ended up in a Nobel Prize for Willis Lamb of Yale University, and it's called the Lamb shift. And this is a recognition that, in fact, this energy disturbs atoms. So atoms aren't sitting in a void, they're sitting in the sea of energy. So once quantum theorists realized that energy was there, the next question was, well, is there any way to tap it? And it was thought originally that probably not. It might be like trying to tap the heat energy around us. And you can quickly prove for thermodynamic reasons that it'll take more energy to tap it than you'd get out of it, so you don't come out ahead. But back in about 1984, a researcher at Hughes Laboratory by the name of Robert Forward showed that there was a particular effect called the Casimir effect, which demonstrated that in fact this energy could be tapped. There's enough energy in the volume of a coffee cup to, say, evaporate all the world's oceans if you could get it all of it. So this raised the issue among theorists. Well, can we manipulate this energy? Could we tap it for spaceflight application, for example? And there are a couple ways to go. Could we get propulsion out of it? Could we use it as an energy source? And so these are the areas that modern theorists are looking at. Here at the Institute for Advanced Studies, one of our main interests is exploring the possibility of tapping or mining this vacuum fluctuation energy, zero-point energy. By the way, we call it zero point because even if you froze the universe down all the way down to absolute zero, where most motion would be frozen out, this energy would still be there. It's a very fundamental kind of energy. But we're looking to see if we can extract it for many uses, not just spaceflight application. I mean, the grand outcome would be that if you could use it to power everything from electric toothbrushes to aircraft carriers to automobiles to homes to space flight.
Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army, retired. Spent 20 years, a little more than that, in the active military, mostly in air defense, various other assignments, field artillery, technical intelligence assignment, liaison to Canada, to some technical work going on site in turbulent wakes and reentry systems and so forth at the Canadian Armament Research and Development Establishment, and spent quite a number of tours in basically R&D work in the military, developing missile systems and things like that. Some associates and I have been researching very heavily into trying to extract electromagnetic energy from the vacuum. Now, we did so under somewhat duress because the conventional electrodynamics model does not allow this to happen. In other words, it doesn't allow you to extract excess energy from the vacuum and use that to power your load. So it doesn't allow you to make a self-powering system. So we took the approach that some of the phenomenology we had seen in experiments and so forth convinced us that it was possible, and there didn't seem to be any real physical reason why it couldn't be extracted if we could find the way to do it. But we had the problem of why doesn't the electrodynamics allow it to be done? So at the same time, we also began a study of the foundations of electronics. In other words, what are the fundamental concepts that are assumed in the theory? Where did they come from? And how did they get in there? And that turned out to be very interesting and very pertinent, because electrodynamics kept getting modified and restricted is what kept happening to it. The original theory that Maxwell had was 20 equations and 20 unknowns, quaternion type equations. What we've done is the closed current loop circuit, where all the carriers have the same mass per charge ratio. All the buckets have the same weight, so to speak. Anytime you build a circuit like that, it's quite easy to show that the amount of energy that circuit collects, when we do this free regauging and we do increase its energy, ever how much it collects, it will then use precisely 50% of that to destroy the thing that let it do that. And it's really the dipole, the source dipole. It will use that to kill itself, so to speak, and have no more excess energy. The other half will go out to the circuit and power the loads and losses. That means less than half gets to the load. Well, to restore that source dipole, in other words, so we can get some more energy in to use, it costs just as much to restore it as was used to destroy it. So we got to put in more than we can ever get out in the load with such a squirrely circuit. And that's the only kind of circuit we've used in power systems since day one. We're still building them. We're still making power systems that deliberately kill them. So we pay the power company to have a giant wrestling match inside its generator and lose. That's really what we pay them for. So that doesn't seem to be the way to run a railroad. It would seem to be much more ideal to freely change the energy of the system, pay a little switching cost so we get it switched over to the load and dump it in the load and let it go, let it power the load. And so you can do it. So the problem we ran into was that the electrodynamics had actually been modified to throw out the very kind of systems that we had seen in our experiments, evidence that could be done, but violates the ordinary electrodynamics. And we can do it and not violate conservation of energy. We can do it in accord with thermodynamics, and we can do it in accord with physics and electromagnetics. Now this is absolutely rigorous. I don't care how many folks want to check that, it will hold up. It is rigorous. So this was one thing we established from the study of the foundations of electromagnetics. You are permitted to have electromagnetic systems that power themselves and their load, and you don't have to put in the energy. They take it from the vacuum, the active vacuum. Our engineers are taught to throw away about 10 trillion times for a typical average case as much energy as they pull out of the vacuum without even knowing it in a generator and a battery. And it's pouring out down the circuit and misses the circuit. They throw all that away and only calculate the little bit that we catch in that circuit and then use. Now, when we measure the circuit, we obviously measure the energy being dissipated by the various pieces of that circuit. Well, if the energy is being thrown out of there, it had to get in there. So obviously the measurements of the circuit will match Poynting's theory, because it'll match the energy that actually went in there to get dissipated. Like the country boy said, you got a pipe here, so to speak, and it's got some holes in it. If you measure all the water flowing out, that's how much water come in it. Now your whole river can be around it and missing the pipe, and you won't measure that. So we have built a whole science based on throwing away this enormous energy that is pulled out of the vacuum by every little old separation of charges, every dipole. Well, in the 50s, in the 1950s, particle physicists discovered, Wu and others discovered broken symmetry. They discovered how fundamental a process something like this dipole is, where we separate two opposite kinds of charges. And T.D. Lee, for example, looked at it for physical charges and so forth, and Lee won a Nobel Prize for it. Any dipole is a broken symmetry in the Furious exchange with a vacuum. It's a broken three-dimensional symmetry. What does this mean? Cutting through all the words and getting down to country boy language. It means that nature does not insist on conserving energy in 3 dimensions. We do, because we have a 3-dimensional mind. We like to think in terms of space, because observation itself destroys time, and what we look at is spatial. So we like to think the world is made of space, not space-time. However, nature loves to work in 4 dimensions. Her fundamental law is conservation of energy must apply in 4 dimensions. Now, you're not going to beat that one, so never think about that. But there is no law of nature that requires you to come in and say, also it must apply simultaneously in 3 dimensions. If we build some gadget that makes it apply in 3 dimensions, we apply an extra constraint on what nature will give us. Turning that around, we go around building things that insist on having this 3-dimensional exchange of energy. We got to put it in 3 dimensions for whatever we get out and lose some in the middle. So we got a terrible situation all the way. It's called entropic engineering. We always got entropy beating us to death. Never go over unity. Forget it. Lose a lot. We talk about, you know, efficiencies at 30% and so forth for our power systems when we talk about burning the coal and all that stuff. But nature doesn't require you to do that. All you have to do is break a little bit of this 3 symmetry set of chains where you have tied her feet to the floor. Once you break the flow in 3 dimensions, you no longer have to conserve energy in 3 dimensions. The basic conservation of energy is an inflow from 4 dimensions, outflow in 3 dimensions. From the 4th dimension, converted and flowed out into 3. And that one is free. Giant negentropy is free. Nature will start reorganizing a goodly percentage of the whole vacuum for you, spreading at the speed of light, and will continue it as long as you leave the dipole alone. The original charges and dipoles in the original matter of the universe have been putting out energy and reorganizing the vacuum for 15 billion years. Today we're said we can't engineer negentropy when negentropy is the easiest thing in the world to engineer, whereas entropy is the hard way to do it, and that's the way we all do it. The bottom line of this is if we'll initiate the negative entropy and let it go, it's just like you punched a hole in the ground and you got a big gusher of oil. You don't have to furnish the pressure and you don't have to furnish the oil. Here it comes. And it comes out in real oil that you can use. And the common dipole in every electrical circuit pours out energy in that fashion. The problem is not how to get enormous energy from the vacuum. That problem been totally solved. It was actually solved in 1903 had we understood it. Had we understood what Whittaker wrote. We didn't. But now we do understand it, and we do certify very rigorously with some of the AIS papers that that is for real. The problem now is how do we catch a goodly bit of this energy and use it asymmetrically. You dump it in a load, let it power that load, and not use half of it to go back over and kill the little dipole. So we set about then to build one that wasn't built that way.
Have you been successful?
Yes, we have been successful. We have just built our second model. The first model produced 5 times out what we put in. We pay for switching costs. We don't put any energy into it to actually power the system. It comes right out of a permanent magnet, which is a dipole. The reason for using a permanent magnet is very simple. You can pass the flux back in a flux channel back through the permanent magnet, and those poles don't get destroyed. They are welded into the material when you magnetize it. That's not like little charges separated in electrical charges. You knock the charges out and destroy the dipole. So we can bypass one of the big problems with a permanent magnet. We don't have to destroy the dipole. That gives us one solution going in. The other is, how do we catch the energy? Well, that turned out to be fairly simple. We found a material which will separate the magnetic field from what's called a magnetic vector potential. The vector potential flows unceasingly from the magnet. It'll flow from now for the next 15 billion years. You can't slow it down. You can't change it as long as that magnet is there. So you have plenty of energy flow. The question is how to use it. So we use it by diversion. We reasoned that this flow will replenish. It's like a river. It's like a humongous river. If we dip some energy out of it, it'll replenish the hole we dipped out of at the speed of light. So for all practical purposes, instantly. So we can dip and dip and dip. We have to pay to switch to do that. But we can keep dipping, and the water fills as fast as we dip it. Then if we come down to another area and we let the water that was replenished still interact with something, and at the same time we dump the water that we dipped in there, we will have more energy by far than what we're paying for dipping. So we looked at it as an energy flow process, which it is, and we found a material which would do part of the dipping for us. It will separate the magnetic field from the magnetic vector potential. Yes, there is a history, a long history of over-unity systems.
What has happened to them?
For example, Nikola Tesla had one. Basically, his big magnifying transformer that he had on Long Island was such an over-energy system. The way that one apparently worked is he got the entire Earth itself in resonance. The crust of the Earth, as you go down in there, is made of highly nonlinear materials, particularly when you get down to the perovskite or whatever you call that stuff. And it will act in the bulk even, it will interact in a sort of a nonlinear optics fashion. It will do phase conjugation. And so eventually what it does is everything going on is feeding energy into the Earth starts to feed energy into that wave that he created. So he gets a lot more energy in his resonant wave fed from outside, from the environment in the interior of the Earth. And that's the way he built up a humongous wave of energy. His idea was you could then put in a tap on it anywhere else on the world and extract it free. And of course J.P. Morgan's take on that was, that's foolish, you can't put a meter on it. So that actually doomed much of Tesla's career at that point when Morgan found out that Tesla was going to produce the energy freely. Small cost here at a central location, everybody else could tap it for free. It wouldn't have powered the whole world today. It would have powered much of the world in those days. Tesla also, we're pretty sure, put a system in a car and ran a car on it. And the reason we're pretty sure is his nephew who rode in the car with him is still alive and can describe the incident and how the engine had no gas, no input of power, and would still run once Tesla got it started. And we know it's perfectly possible. Tesla apparently knew how to use this giant negentropy process that's universal everywhere. Energy is free for the taking from the vacuum anywhere you want it. We just have to learn to use that. The best scientists we have, the best grad students, the best postdocs ought to be turned loose on this problem, and that means funded. And that means that we do not allow scientists to slander and libel people who are trying to do research in this area. Right now they do it wholesale and they do it at will. Now, look at what they call me in print, for goodness sake. But the problem is the scientific community resists change and it's doing business as usual. And my bottom line is, unless the legislative branch, together with the administration, forces them to get on this problem and solve it, they will not only fiddle while Rome burns, they will help burn it. The only alternative you have now, of course, since at this moment, as we speak, the government has not moved. The scientific community has not moved. So that is a fact as of this moment I'm speaking. I hope that changes. I'm trying to change it. But right now, that is a fact. And right now it's a fact they're not going to move unless something happens to move them, and neither is the scientific community. Failing that, the only thing left is the private industry. And that's a mixed bag. First of all, the moment you try to do it in the private industry, then is when you are absolutely vulnerable to all the games. For example, lawsuit alone can hang you to where you will never come out of it for the next 15 years. The lawsuit doesn't have to be justified or anything at all. You can sue anybody for anything if you've got enough money to file the suit and want to swear. Simple as that. So the other thing you have is you can trigger anybody from anywhere for all kinds of radicals to come out of there and say, oh, you used a coil of wire, or you used something over here, you used some semiconductor, you stole my invention. And so the next thing you can be in court for 20 years on that. All of this comes at you. This is part of the delay. This is the groups wanting to stay in power while we all go down the tubes. They operate primarily in the private sector. So you're automatically in that arena where the real lions are after you all the time. You're over there trying to find a legitimate deal. Okay, let's talk about venture capital, sometimes called vulture capital. But if you find a good one, it's not vulture, it's venture. What does a venture capitalist want to do? He wants to buy 30% or 50% of your company, or 51, or maybe 60. He's got the money. Then the next thing he wants to do is he's going to move you and all your guys right out of there, and he's going to put his own management team in there, and he's going to run it with bean counters. If you run this one with bean counters only, you destroy the program before you start. So your only choice then is to avoid venture capitalists like the plague and to try to go for licensing, which means the brunt of doing the research on the front end falls on you and your meager resources, which for working people is whatever you can afford out of your back pocket. But if you don't do that, you're not going to do it anyway. How many have you seen in the past that went the venture capital route that were real? How many of them made it? I can name 3 or 4 that were real. They're not there yet. They're not going to be there. They were buried. So the thing that sets in, you have to do it by licensing. Then you got to get the patent office. The patent office says it's impossible to do an over unity system. The API, the Physics Institute, comes down on you and says it's absolutely against the laws of nature. It isn't. These are people who haven't even studied the problem, and they know classical thermodynamics, but it's against the laws of nature and it violates classical thermodynamics. Of course it violates classical thermo. You can't build one of these by classical thermo. You build it by the other kind of thermodynamics. So the next thing you have is the scientific community is all over. Look what they did to cold fusion. There's real stuff in cold fusion. 600 experiments worked, for goodness sake. So the thing is, you're against the scientific community is against you, lock, stock, and barrel. And by the way, everything is a distribution curve. Get off of this horse pucky about scientists are always sweet, nice, reasonable people. That is not true. 10% of them are devils. 10% of them are angels, ought to be rewarded at the salt of the earth. But 10% of them have absolutely no ethics, absolutely playing nothing but the big monkey and power game, and absolutely your worst enemy in this area. Glorious opportunity to, in other words, the vultures, or there's a better word for it, the wolves go around looking for the rabbits, and you're the rabbit and they're the wolf. So your next thing you get into is a big wolf-rabbit game with the scientists over on that 10%. So you face all of that. Meanwhile, you've got to go to the patent office. You get to the patent office, what are you looking at? This is impossible. This is perpetual motion. You say, well, the atoms have been doing this for 15 billion years. It's not perpetual motion, but it's just long-lasting. But they call it perpetual motion, and of course there is an unwritten law that anything that's perpetual motion shall not be even proved or looked at. You can't even get a serious consideration in the patent office. I speak as one who has submitted patents in this area. I know what I'm talking about. I've defended a couple of them. So what we have is a situation where the entire structure of science, industry, the organizations of science, and the patent office are already against you. If you can't get a patent, how can you license? So it's a real neat little thing. It's the old chicken and egg situation. If I had the chickens, I could get some eggs. If I had the eggs, I could get some chickens. This situation is designed so you never get chickens and you never get eggs. So the only thing you can do is to try to put your head down and continue with that and do one other thing, communication. Fortunately, we do have the internet. Sure, it's full of a lot of bad information. It's also full of a lot of good information. You just have to discriminate. So the other thing you have to do to have any chance at all is communicate, 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 which we do to the limit that we're legally able to do and not lose our patents. If we can get the government to move, they can cut through all of that by simply issuing the order to do it. And that's what it's going to take.
The fascinating thing about zero-point energy is, to just step back and explain it, is that zero-point energy essentially is the energy that the vacuum possesses as we go down to a state of zero gas, zero heat, and zero pressure. So the conversion of zero-point energy is probably happening all around us. I just listened to a talk by Tom Bearden recently, who also says that zero-point energy is constantly being converted. I met another scientist at the Institute for New Energy a month ago that told me the same thing. From his research, for decades of work, Martin Marietta and other places, he felt that zero-point energy was something more apparent than we even know is real. So right now we're discovering that there are ways to not only get heat out of the vacuum. Hal Puthoff published a physics review article on that. We can also get energy out of the vacuum, according to his theory. And it's very possible that we can provide some kind of force. I would say that the motivation or the motive for the Patent Office to be suppressing various types of energy inventions is certainly motivated by other government agencies. And other government agencies, even for example, the American Physical Society, benefits by certain government grants. I think the motive also within the Patent Office is to save face. So I literally lost my job at the Patent Office for trying to educate the public and the examiners on new energy inventions that could save our planet, that are carbon-free and fuelless. When we particularly look at the next 20 years, we're relying upon the import and usage of about 20 million barrels of oil per day, and we import about half of that from OPEC. We're unfortunately in the very strongly dependent mode of thinking that that flow of oil, which is a huge amount of oil, is infinite and will continue to flow indefinitely. The best experts, and I've consulted various books, including World Watch Society, predicts that around 2010 we're going to peak in the world resource availability, and then we'll see a slow decline. Well, just a few months ago, actually 1 month ago in September, the OPEC nations got together for the first time in 25 years. And when OPEC got together, they basically didn't respond to either the United States or the European nation demand for increased output. Instead, they basically said, we'll supply steady output at a fair price. And so what I believe is happening, and I suppose there are other critics as well that will analyze this situation, knowing that there is a peak coming up and a forced decline, the best way they can profit, since they hold 2/3 of the world's oil reserves, is to essentially cut back 1% like they did last year, now instead of later. And by doing that, they force prices up artificially high and essentially get us ready for being weaned off of this biological fluid. And when we realize what we're doing to the atmosphere as well by being dependent upon this dead fossil remains from our ancient history, that now we're forcing that carbon up into the atmosphere, our carbon dioxide levels have now surpassed 300 parts per billion for the first time in 400,000 years. And that's been verified by work at the National Atmospheric Centers. So what we realize is that we're all of a sudden now importing into the atmosphere a highly potent greenhouse gas that is scheduled to double within about 50 years. Our energy consumption demand and has to have 20% more within 20 years. We don't know where that's going to come from. And if we expect that OPEC's going to provide it, we're going to be sadly mistaken. And I believe that a war for oil is scheduled in our near future, especially when a presidential candidate says we're going to be a hardliner against OPEC to demand more oil. Who are we to demand from somebody who controls the market? So I think essentially that our human race to survive has to have free energy. We were at a collision course right now. Our economy cannot expect to expand. Our propulsion industry, firecrackers going up in the air to send a little 1% of our space payload to a near-Earth orbit is a huge waste of money. I feel very strongly that free energy and anti-gravity are very imminent, and that there are a lot of inventors that have put together the basis for this type of new energy future, and it's just a matter of us getting investors together and doing the work. So we have a very good future to look forward to, but it involves new thinking and getting rid of the old meter J.P. Morgan mentality, where we have to pay for our energy consistently month after month and gallon after gallon.